In the 37th floor conference room of Mercer and Company, the AC blasted like winter. Claire Morgan sat in a frayed cardigan, hands folded, wedding ring turning on a thumb that wouldn't stop shaking. Grant Mercer didn't sit. He tossed a folder across the walnut table. It hit with a thud. "Sign," he said. "Then take your check and disappear." Tessa Ray stood at his shoulder in a white suit. Her heel clicked. Tick, tick, like a countdown. The paralegal at the side table stared hard at her notepad. "This is fair," Grant announced. 50 grand, the old accord. No spousal support, no future claims. Clean cut. Claire stared at the framed photo on the credenza, their wedding day. Her smile in lace, his hand on her waist like he owned her. The sight made her throat burn. "You're really doing this," she said. "I should have done it years ago," Grant snapped. "I pulled you out of a diner and you never learned to fit in. You're small." He flicked his gaze over her cardigan. "You embarrass me." Tessa's lips curved.
"Grant's firm is going public. Investors don't want baggage."
Baggage. The word landed like a slap. Claire kept her face still because crying only fed them. She opened the folder. Legal lines blurred until she found the boxed clause. Complete severance, no rights to the other party's future assets, earnings, or debts. Grant twirled a glossy black pen, one she'd once saved grocery money to buy. "Don't overthink it," he said. "You don't have assets worth protecting." Claire's eyes lifted to the ceiling corner, a small dome camera, a tiny red light blinking. Grant had installed it for compliance, bragging it protected the company from liars. She looked back at the clause, then at Grant. "So you waive any claim to what comes after today?" she said quietly. "Everything." Grant laughed, sharp and loud. "To what? Your broke little bank account? Sign." Claire reached into her purse and pulled out a cheap clinic pen. The ink scratched. She signed her name, neat and final. Grant snatched the papers, grinning at Tessa. "Finally," he muttered. "Security will escort you." Claire stood. She didn't plead. She didn't look at Tessa. She walked to the door with her chin high. Behind her, the red light kept blinking, saving every word Grant would later deny. And the person monitoring that feed had just hit record. Claire Morgan was 44, and she'd learned to walk through rain without showing it on her face. Outside Mercer and Company, midtown traffic hissed on wet asphalt. She tucked the settlement check into the side pocket of her thrift store purse, right behind a pill organizer labeled Mom, and headed for the subway. At 6 a.m. every weekday, Claire worked the front desk at St. Bridget Community Clinic in Queens. Not glamorous, not loud, just phone calls, insurance forms, and the steady patience of someone who'd watched fear turn into paperwork. She kept a jar of peppermints for nervous patients and a spare scarf in her drawer for the ones who came in shivering. That morning, before Grant's sign or disappear meeting, she'd still shown up early to print an appeal letter for Mr. D'Angelo, an 80-year-old widower who couldn't afford his heart meds. She'd used her own ink cartridge at home because the clinic printer was always out of budget. Claire's phone buzzed now. A photo of her mother, Ruth, flashed on the lock screen. Ruth in a recliner, smiling, oxygen tube taped to her cheek. Claire's throat tightened. Ruth would need her refill by Friday, and the copay had jumped again. She climbed the station stairs, knees aching, and checked her bank app out of habit. The balance was what it always was, thin. Still, she'd promised herself, rent first, groceries second, pride last.
She'd skipped lunch all week, saving the $10 a day so her son, Evan,
Could keep his field trip deposit and not be shamed.
On the train, she replayed Grant's voice, the word baggage, the way Tess's heel clicked like a judge's gavel. Claire pressed her palm to the place where her ring used to sit, a pale circle of skin, tender as a bruise. Across from her, a teenager offered his seat to a pregnant woman. Claire smiled at the simple decency and felt something inside her steady. Good people still existed. She just had to remember she was one of them.
At the next stop, her email chimed. Subject line: Compliance Review, Conference Room 37B. No sender name, just an internal address she didn't recognize. Her stomach dipped. Grant never used the word compliance unless it meant someone was about to get hurt. She opened it. One sentence, no greeting. Do not go home tonight. Your keys were copied. And the message was time-stamped 6 minutes before she signed. At home in Queens, Claire's apartment smelled of menthol rub and dishwasher soap.
Her mother's oxygen concentrator hummed beside the couch,
A steady, needy purr that never let Claire forget the clock was always running. Ruth Morgan's lungs had been weak since the winter pneumonia. The hospital called it chronic, a word that sounded like forever. Medicare covered some, not all. The rest sat in a manila folder on the kitchen table, invoices, co-pays, denial letters, and one pink notice stamped final. Claire kept it under a magnet shaped like a sunflower.
because Evan liked sunflowers, and she couldn't bear to see the word final every time she reached for milk. Evan, 12, was in his room doing homework at the wobbly desk she'd found on the curb. He was the kind of kid who apologized when he sneezed. Tonight he ate ramen without complaining, then rinsed the bowl like he'd seen her do 1,000 times. "Mom," he said softly, "if the trip costs too much, I can tell Mr. Briggs I'm sick." Claire swallowed hard. "No."
"You're going." That was the problem with leaving Grant. It wasn't just love or habit. It was math. Grant's company plan paid for Ruth's respiratory therapist. Grant's credit line had floated the down payment on the apartment. And Grant, quietly, efficiently, had arranged their finances so every road led back to him. The joint checking account was the only one with a real cushion, and it was still in his name first. The clinic paycheck went in, then vanished into auto-pays she hadn't set up. When she asked, he'd smiled and said, "Don't worry your head. I handle grown-up stuff." Claire opened her laptop and logged into the utility portal. A red banner flashed. "Past due. Service interruption." She checked the date. Tomorrow. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. A photo message loaded, a close-up of her front door lock taken from inside the hallway. Under it, one line. "He has a spare now." Claire stared at the picture until her fingers went numb. Ruth coughed in the dark, and Evan's pencil paused mid-scratch. Claire slid the manila folder into a drawer, grabbed her phone, and opened the email again, hands sweating hard. And someone tried her doorknob, once, twice, like they already belonged there. By 7 that evening, the rain had stopped, but the street still shone like black glass. Claire left Ruth settled with her nebulizer and asked Mrs. Alvarez from next door to sit with her for 2 hours. The clinic's fundraiser was mandatory, the email had said, because Mercer and Company was considering renewed community support. The event was held in the Grand Hastings Hotel, a ballroom dressed in white linen and cold blue light. A string quartet played soft hymns near the bar, while donors in tuxedos floated from table to table, laughing too loudly. At the entrance, a step-and-repeat banner read, "St. Bridget Community Clinic. Health is dignity." Claire's name badge looked small against the slogan. She moved like staff.
Not guessed, checking the silent auction sheets, straightening centerpieces, refilling the peppermint bowl near the registration desk. Every time she touched her purse, she felt the hard edge of the settlement check and the softer edge of Ruth's pink final notice she'd shoved in behind it. On stage, a microphone stood alone beneath a projector screen. The screen cycled through sponsor logos, banks, law firms, and at the very end, Mercer & Co. A camera on a tripod faced the podium, its red tally light blinking. "Live stream for transparency," the AV tech said when Claire glanced at it. "Compliance requested it." A waiter brushed past her with champagne, and Claire caught her own reflection in a mirrored pillar, tired eyes, damp hair, cardigan under a borrowed blazer. She forced her shoulders back. Tonight wasn't about pride. It was about oxygen tubing, rent, and Evan's field trip. Then the doors at the back opened, and the room shifted the way water shifts when something heavy enters. Grant Mercer walked in with a smile so polished it looked painless. He wore a navy suit, no tie, sleeves rolled like a man who cared about work and people. Beside him was Tessa, glittering in silver, holding his arm like she belonged. Grant didn't look at Claire at first. He waved at donors, shook hands, posed for photos. When he finally met Claire's eyes, his smile stayed, but his gaze went sharp, measuring. He lifted a sealed envelope from his inner pocket and tapped it against his palm, once, twice, like a promise. Somewhere above the dais, the camera's light kept blinking, waiting. And Claire realized the fundraiser was just the stage. Grant had brought the next knife. Grant Mercer had always known how to wear kindness like a tailored coat. In the Hastings ballroom, he moved from table to table, clasping hands, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, letting donors believe they were changing the world. The clinic director, Dr. Patel, hovered beside him, grateful and nervous, because Mercer & Company had promised a matching gift that could keep St. Bridget open another year. Claire stayed near the registration desk, but Grant's gaze kept finding her. When he finally approached, his voice softened for the crowd. "There she is," he said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. "My ex. Claire, you look comfortable." Tessa's smile flashed. "Grant worries about you," she purred. "He's still so generous." Generous. Claire remembered the night he cut her debit card off while Ruth was wheezing, then made her beg before he fixed it. She remembered him taking her paycheck for household budgeting, then criticizing her for not contributing enough. Grant leaned closer, blocking the camera's line of sight with his body. His breath smelled like mint and control. "Don't make this hard," he murmured. "That check is all you get. If you cause a scene, I'll call the clinic board and remind them your mother's therapy was on my plan. Understand?" Claire's stomach clenched. He wasn't just divorcing her. He was amputating every support beam she had left. A waiter passed with a tray. Grant plucked 2 flutes, offered one to Tessa, then to Claire without looking. "Toast to new beginnings," he said brightly. "I don't drink," Claire replied. "Oh, right," Grant said, louder again. "She likes to play saint." He chuckled and several guests joined in, relieved to laugh with him. Dr. Patel stepped up. "Mr. Mercer, we're ready for your remarks." Grant tapped the sealed envelope against his palm. "Perfect timing." His eyes slid back to Claire. "Stay where I can see you." As he walked toward the podium, Tessa brushed Claire's shoulder. "He's being nice," she whispered. "Don't ruin it." On stage, Grant adjusted the microphone, waiting until the room quieted. He held the envelope up like an award. Tonight, he announced, we clear away dead weight and fund real progress. Claire felt the floor tilt as security at the door shifted their stance toward her. Her heart hammered, but she refused to shrink. And Grant nodded to them, signaling the show would start on his command. Tessa Ray wasn't just Grant's date, she was his knife with lipstick. She drifted through the Hastings ballroom, greeting donors by name, laughing at their stories,
and steering every compliment toward Mercer and Company and responsible leadership. Claire kept to the registration desk, but she watched Tessa slip to Dr. Patel's table. The clinic director stood, anxious, as if he might be graded. Tessa leaned close, voice low, smile bright. "The matching gift depends on tomorrow's board vote," she said. "You'll follow the talking points, and you'll keep Claire quiet." Dr. Patel's hands tightened around his water glass. "She's staff."
She's been loyal. Loyal doesn't pay invoices, Tessa murmured. Marla Cushing, chair of the clinic board, joined them in a column of pearls and perfume. Marla used to bring cookies to the clinic and call Claire our heartbeat. Tonight she didn't glance Claire's way. She checked the room like a manager checking exits. "Security is in place," Marla said. "Live stream is live. Camera is locked on the podium." Grant arrived, sliding between them like he owned the air. He kept his voice polite for anyone nearby, but his eyes were flat. "No heroics," he told Dr. Patel. "You want my money. You play this clean." Dr. Patel swallowed. "What are we doing to her?" Tessa opened her clutch and laid a thin folder on the table. Incident report was printed in bold. "We're protecting the clinic," she said. "Petty cash discrepancy, policy violations, emotional instability after her divorce today. We ask for her resignation publicly so donors feel safe." Claire's stomach dropped. There had been no missing cash. She had receipts, copied and stapled, in her desk drawer at work. Grant tapped the folder with one finger. "After I speak, you invite her up," he said. "She signs a resignation letter. If she refuses, we escort her out. Either way, she's gone before dessert." Marla hesitated, just for a breath. Then she nodded. "Understood." Claire backed away, breath shallow, clipboard shaking in her hands. Across the room, Grant stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone. Tessa followed, holding the folder like a script. She placed it beside the mic, angled to the front row, then nodded to the AV tech. A soft chime sounded, and heads turned, curious, toward Claire at the desk. The projector snapped to life, and Claire's employee photo filled the screen like a wanted poster. The ballroom quieted as the projector held Claire's face like a mugshot. Grant's voice rolled through the speakers, warm as honey. "St. Bridget is a sacred place," he said, "which is why we have zero tolerance for misuse of donor funds." Heads turned. Claire felt every stare land on her cardigan, her worn flats, the name badge that looked like a target. Marla Cushing stepped to the microphone, pearls catching the light. "Claire Morgan, please come forward." Claire's legs moved before her mind caught up. She walked the center aisle between tables of donors and physicians, past plates of salmon, past women in gowns that cost more than her rent. A few people smiled politely, the way you smile at someone who is about to be fired. On stage, the spotlight bleached color from her face. The live stream camera blinked at her from a few feet away. Marla handed her a page. "This is a voluntary resignation," she said, still smiling. "Due to discrepancies in petty cash and repeated policy violations." "That's not true," Claire said. Her voice sounded small in the room. "I have receipts." Grant leaned into his microphone. "Claire," he said gently, like he was correcting a child, "don't lie. It's ugly." A ripple of laughter slid across the tables. Someone whispered, "So she's a thief," loud enough for Claire to hear. Her cheeks burned. She looked for Dr. Patel for any friendly face, but he stared at the floor. "I didn't take anything," Claire insisted. "I covered supplies with my own money." Tessa stepped closer, her dress glittering. "That's the problem," she murmured, eyes cold. "You're always a charity case, always begging to be saved." Marla tapped the paper with a manicured nail. "Sign, and we'll spare everyone the details." Claire's hands shook as she took the pen. She didn't sign. She lifted her chin. "I won't confess to something I didn't do." Grant's smile vanished for a heartbeat. He clicked his fingers at the AV tech. The microphone in front of Claire went dead. Her next words vanished into silence while Grant's voice stayed loud and clear. "Security," he said, "please escort Miss Morgan out. We can't risk contamination." 2 guards took her arms. The room watched as if this was part of the entertainment. As they led her toward the side exit, Claire caught Tessa's whisper to Marla near the curtain. "Call the locksmith tonight." Security marched Claire behind the curtain, away from polite applause and into a narrow hallway smelling of bleach and coffee. One guard kept his hand on her elbow. Not rough, just certain, like she was already convicted tonight in public. Her badge was clipped to her blazer. Marla had yanked it off, tossing it into a trash bin without looking. Claire's phone vibrated again, and Mrs. Alvarez texted, "Someone's knocking hard, asking for you by name." I didn't open yet. A second message followed. "He says he's from the building, has a work order for your lock." What should I? Fear made Claire's mouth go dry. She pictured Ruth on the couch, oxygen tube bright against her cheek at home. She tried calling Grant, then stopped. He wanted her desperate, and desperation was a leash he understood too well today. At the end of the corridor, an open AV room glowed blue, monitors showing the ballroom from 3 angles live. A young tech in a headset muttered, "Stream still running?" And his screen replayed Claire's silent, cut-off mouth on loop. Claire stepped closer and saw the time code, the mic mute click, and Grant's grin perfectly synchronized in HD for everyone watching. "Company policy archives everything," the text said to nobody, plugging a thumb drive into the recorder labeled "Compliance Copy Daily." In the reflection of a dark monitor, Claire saw Tessa outside the door, slipping a folded bill to a guard. The guard nodded, then pulled out his phone, snapping a photo of Claire like he was logging inventory for proof. Claire's hands clenched, but she forced herself to notice details. The guard's name tag read, "Frank Hollis, Hotel Security Supervisor." Frank glanced at her, then at the thumb drive, and his eyes flickered with something that wasn't cruelty this time. He lowered his voice. "Ma'am, you didn't steal," he said, like the words weighed more than his paycheck in there. Claire's throat tightened. "Then why did you drag me out?" she whispered, eyes burning, pride hanging by a thread tonight. Frank didn't answer. He just tapped the ceiling camera above the hallway door, then pointed to the recorder beside it. Claire understood. Proof existed, and someone ordinary could decide whether it vanished or survived the night for the right person. Frank slipped the thumb drive into his pocket and said, "Go check your door, now," before turning away fast from them. Claire ran from the service entrance into the damp night, Frank's warning ringing in her ears. She called Mrs. Alvarez. No answer. She called again, and finally the older woman picked up, whispering, "They're in the hallway, mija. 2 men. One has tools, Ruth is scared. Claire hailed a cab with trembling hands. Halfway to Queens, a new alert hit her phone. Your Mercer and Company health plan has been terminated effective immediately. It was an automated email, time-stamped 8:12 p.m., right after the projector showed her face. No, she breathed. Without that plan, Ruth's oxygen rental and respiratory visits would be impossible. She burst through her building's lobby doors and froze. A locksmith knelt at her apartment door, drilling. Marla Cushing stood nearby, coat still on, as if she'd followed for the encore. Beside her was Grant, calm, holding a folder. "Ma'am?" the locksmith said, not looking up. "Work order says rekey. Tenant requested." "I didn't request anything," Claire snapped. Grant lifted a hand, gentle for the lobby cameras. "Claire, don't shout. You're upsetting your mother." His eyes flicked to the super, who hovered with a clipboard. "It's a safety issue." Ruth's cough rasped from inside. Claire lunged for the knob, but the guard from downstairs blocked her path. Mrs. Alvarez hovered behind him, furious and helpless. Marla opened the folder and produced a printed letter. "Emergency board action," she said. "Your employment is suspended pending investigation. Clinic access is revoked." "And her insurance?" Claire demanded. Grant's smile sharpened. "A benefit of employment," he said. "You refuse to cooperate, so the benefit ends. Simple." Claire's knees went weak. She pictured Ruth's oxygen concentrator being unplugged, the quiet panic in Ruth's eyes. "Let me in," Claire pleaded, hating the word as soon as it left her mouth. Grant leaned closer. "Sign the resignation," he murmured, "and I'll reinstate the plan for 30 days, enough time to transition." Claire stared at the drill, at the new key ring waiting on the locksmith's belt, at the folder in Grant's hand. The superintendent cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer paid the arrears," he said, avoiding her eyes. "New lease terms. If you're not on it by midnight, you're trespassing." Claire's phone buzzed, Evan texting from a neighbor's. "Mom, why are people saying you stole?" Her vision blurred, but she stood. Then Grant slid out one more document, a court order with Evan's name at the top. Grant held the court order up like a trophy, angled so the lobby camera could read the header. "Emergency custody," he said, voice calm, volume high. "Until the investigation is resolved, Evan stays with me." The superintendent shifted, clutching his clipboard, while two uniformed officers stepped out of the elevator. Neighbors gathered near the mailboxes, pretending to check letters, but their eyes fixed on Claire. Behind her, Ruth's oxygen machine hummed through the half-open door, and the thin wheeze of her cough cut through the silence. Claire's hands were still on the doorknob, as if she could hold the whole apartment in place by grip alone. Grant nodded to the locksmith. "Finish." Metal shrieked as the drill bit bit deeper, and Claire flinched like it was her bone. Marla smoothed her pearls and spoke to the onlookers. "This is for patient safety. We can't have someone unstable around medication and cash." Claire stared at her. "You've seen my receipts." Grant's smile returned. "Receipts can be forged. Lies can be rehearsed. But a mother who steals?" He turned to the nearest neighbor. "Would you trust her with a child?" A woman Claire recognized from the third floor whispered, "Poor Evan," and looked away. Claire's phone buzzed again. Evan's location sharing pinged from the apartment across the hall. One officer cleared his throat. "Ms. Morgan, we need to speak with your son. Please step aside." Claire's voice cracked. "He hasn't done anything." Grant leaned in, low enough that only she could hear. "You wanted dignity? Then watch how fast it disappears when you're labeled a thief. Ruth called faintly from inside.
Claire? Honey? What's happening?
Claire tried to answer, but the guard blocked the doorway and the locksmith snapped the new deadbolt into place with a final click. The crowd heard it and murmured as if a verdict had been delivered. Grant handed the officer the custody order. Take Evan now. I'll handle the rest. The officer reached for his radio when the elevator chimed again. Frank Hollis strode in, security jacket damp with rain. Claire's heart jumped. He was the supervisor who'd pulled her from the AV room. Frank ignored Grant and faced the officers, raising an evidence bag. I ran the live stream, he said. You're about to remove a child based on lies. Grant's voice sharpened. Get out. Frank set the bag down. Don't. This thumb drive shows who framed her tonight. Frank's voice cut through the lobby like a siren. I have the footage, he repeated, holding the evidence bag up for the officers and the building's camera. For one fragile second, the crowd hesitated. Even the locksmith paused, drill hanging. The superintendent blinked, confused, as if he'd been handed a different script. Grant recovered first. He let out a soft laugh. This is adorable, he said. A hotel god playing hero. Officers? That drive is stolen property. My firm paid for the stream. He's interfering with a lawful custody order. Tessa stepped closer, eyes bright with cruel confidence. He's been bribed, she told the neighbors. Claire's desperate. She'll say anything. Whispers spread anyway, fast, hungry. There's video? So the mic really got cut. Why mute her if she was guilty? People leaned in, not to help, but to enjoy the shift. Ruth's voice rose behind the door, thin and panicked. Claire? Honey? I can't breathe. The oxygen machine whined louder, like it sensed danger. Claire tried to push past the guard. Please, she said to the officer, my mother needs her mask. Just let me... The officer's expression softened, but he glanced at Grant's paperwork, then at the eyes watching him. Ma'am, step back. Evan appeared in the hallway across from Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, barefoot, hoodie half-zipped. His face was pale, confused, and the sight of him cracked Claire's chest open. Mom? He called. Why is Dad here? Grant turned on his father's smile, perfect for witnesses. Buddy, I'm here to keep you safe. Safe. The word made several neighbors nod, relieved to have a simple story. Frank held his ground. Play it, he told the officers. Just watch 30 seconds. You'll see him order security to mute her. Grant's jaw tightened. He stared at Claire, warning in his eyes. Fight me, and you lose everything. Claire looked down, trying to steady her hands, and realized her purse was open. The side pocket where she'd tucked the settlement check and Ruth's final notice was empty. Her key ring was gone too. The realization hit harder than the stares. Without that check, she couldn't pay the oxygen supplier. Without keys, she couldn't reach Evan's school papers or Ruth's prescriptions. She met Frank's eyes. He looked ready to fight. But he couldn't replace what had just been stolen by Grant's hands. Plain sight. And she saw Tessa's clutch bulging with a familiar sunflower magnet. Claire's eyes locked on Tessa's clutch. The sunflower magnet, yellow petals, chipped corner, was unmistakable. It had been on Ruth's fridge for years, holding the pink final notice in place. Tessa, Claire said, stepping forward. Give it back. Tessa blinked, innocent for the audience. Give what back? You took my keys, my check, my mother's bills. Claire's voice shook, but it carried.
Neighbors leaned closer.
Grant's face hardened. "Stop this," he warned. "You're spiraling." Frank moved toward the evidence bag on the counter. "Officers, let me play. One more step and you're trespassing," Grant snapped at him. The officer glanced between Grant and Frank, then made a decision that felt like a door slamming. "Ms. Morgan, we're executing the temporary order. Evan, come here, buddy." Evan's eyes filled. He reached for Claire's hand, then froze when Grant placed a palm on his shoulder, steering him away like property. Claire lunged, but the downstairs guard caught her arm. Ruth's voice rose behind the new lock, ragged and wet.
"Claire, I can't."
A hard cough. Then a thud, like a body sliding off cushions. Claire went still. Her brain screamed, but her mouth couldn't find sound.
"Let her in,"
Mrs. Alvarez cried.
"She's sick."
Grant lowered his voice to Claire's ear. "Sign the resignation and I'll send a nurse. Refuse, and you'll watch her drown in air." Claire's knees buckled. She felt the old reflex, beg, bargain, shrink, reach up like a hand around her throat. Then she remembered the muted microphone, the laughing donors, the way he smiled while he hurt her. She pulled back, breathing through pain. "No," she whispered. "I'm done begging." The officers escorted Evan toward the elevator. Claire followed until the doors closed, her son's face disappearing behind stainless steel. She stumbled into the stairwell and sank onto the cold concrete, pressing her fist to her mouth so the sob wouldn't echo. Her phone shook in her hand. Her tears warmed her knuckles. Outside, the elevator cables groaned as Evan rose away from her. Claire stared at the blank concrete and counted breaths, 1 to 10, until her shaking eased enough to stand again, upright. A new call lit the screen. Unknown. Then a text from the same hidden address as before. "I have your receipts, your access logs, and the live stream backup. Meet me at Street. Bridget, midnight." And the message included a photo of Grant signing the false incident report. By the time Claire reached St. Bridget, the clinic parking lot was empty and slick with rain. The front doors were locked, but the lobby lights were on, dim as an after-hours confession booth. She knocked anyway. No one answered. Her key card had been deactivated. The reader flashed red, then went dark. Through the glass, she saw her own reflection, mascara streaked, hair frizzed, shoulders bent under a life that refused to stay on one side of the line. Her phone rang. "Oxygen Care Supplies." A bored voice said, "Mrs. Morgan, we didn't receive payment for the concentrator rental. Without confirmation tonight, we schedule pickup tomorrow morning." "I can pay," Claire lied, tasting metal. "I just need until Monday." "Account notes show insurance terminated," the voice replied. "We need a card on file." Claire stared at her empty purse pocket, at the missing check that had been her last bridge. "Please," she said, "my mother will die without it." Silence, then, "I'm sorry. Policy." Another call cut in, a hospital number. "Is this Claire Morgan?" a nurse asked. "Your mother was brought in by EMS, respiratory distress. Do you have insurance information?" Claire gripped her phone until her knuckles whitened. "Her plan was canceled," she whispered. "I'm trying to fix it." "We need a guarantor," the nurse said, gentler now. "Otherwise, the physician may discharge with minimal equipment." Claire's knees folded. She sat on the wet curb outside the clinic and watched water run into the storm drain like time leaving her. Evan was somewhere with Grant. Ruth was in an ER bed. She had no keys, no money, no job,
and no one left a call who wouldn't ask first what she did to deserve this. A final email arrived from St. Bridget HR. Termination for cause. Her access to Ruth's medical records was revoked.
When she tried her debit card at a corner bodega for water, it declined twice in public, shaking. Headlights swept the lot. A sedan rolled in and stopped beside her. Frank Hollis stepped out, holding an umbrella and a paper bag. "I tracked you," he said, offering the bag. Inside were peppermints and a folded printout. Clinic receipts, cash logs, and the live stream mute command. Claire looked up, hope and rage mixing like lightning. "Why help me?" she asked. Frank met her gaze, steady. "Because I saw everything, and I'm willing to swear to it." Frank unlocked the side door of St. Bridget with a master key and waved Claire inside. The clinic smelled like alcohol wipes and old coffee, familiar enough to hurt. He led her past the dark waiting room to a cramped office where a single desk lamp burned. "Sit," he said. "Breathe. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Claire's hands wouldn't stop trembling. She pictured Evan's face disappearing behind the elevator doors and Ruth gasping in an ER bed. "They took everything," she whispered. "My check, my keys, my name." Frank set the paper bag on the desk and pulled out a thick binder, the kind auditors used. On the cover he'd written in block letters, "Mercer Incident Timeline." "I pulled these from the live stream system and the hotel security server," he said. "Timestamps don't lie." He flipped to page 1, a screenshot of Grant nodding while the audio icon on Claire's mic turned gray. Page 2, the AV text control panel showing mute input 2, authorized user, Gmerker. Page 3, a still frame of Pessa placing the incident folder beside the podium. Claire stared until her vision cleared. "You can swear this is real?" she asked. "I'm the supervisor," Frank said. "Chain of custody is mine. I logged the export, sealed the drive, and I'll testify to every step." A knock sounded. Claire's spine stiffened. Frank opened the door and an older woman stepped in, raincoat over scrubs, hair in a tight bun. "Claire Morgan?" she asked. "I'm Nora Delgado, legal aid. Frank called me 10 minutes ago." Nora set a folder on the desk. Inside were emergency forms, motion to reinstate benefits, motion to challenge custody, and a letter to the clinic board demanding preservation of records. "Mercer is using money and fear," Nora said. "We use paper and proof." Claire swallowed. "My mother's oxygen." "We can file for a temporary medical order at dawn," Nora said. "But we need one more thing. The clinic's petty cash log showing your reimbursements." Frank pointed down the hallway. "It's in the finance office," he said, "and the lockbox has a camera." Claire stood, legs shaky but straight. For the first time all night, hope felt like something solid. She wiped her cheeks and gripped the binder, treating it like a lifeline. Nora checked her watch and said, "We have 3 hours to get the log before Mercer's people erase it." Frank led them down the dark hall to finance, where the door had a keypad and a tiny lens above it. "Smile," he murmured, pointing at the lens. "That camera records every entry. It'll prove we were here legally." Nora set her phone on record, the red dot pulsing. Claire's stomach knotted as Frank keyed in the code and the lock clicked. Inside, the office was silent except for the printer's standby hum and the rain tapping the window. The petty cash lockbox sat in a steel cabinet. A second camera faced it, aimed like an accusation. Frank opened the cabinet slowly, hands visible. "Chain of custody," he said. "You touch nothing until I log it."
He pulled a ledger binder and flipped to the month's page.
Claire's name appeared again and again beside neat entries. Bandage packs, $12.84. Nebulizer tubing, $19.10. Printer ink, $43.99. Each line had a reimbursement signature, Dr. Patel's, not Claire's. Next to the totals, a different handwriting had added a red note, unverified. "That's the lie," Nora whispered. "They relabeled approved reimbursements as theft." Frank photographed every page, then printed the system access log from the clinic's accounting software. The timestamps were brutal. The incident report file was created at 7:58 p.m., edited at 8:01 p.m., and approved at 8:03 p.m. While Claire was still on stage, mic muted. Claire's breath hitched. "So they wrote it during the humiliation." Nora nodded. "And we can prove it." Frank opened the lockbox again and removed a single envelope stamped "Board Packet." Inside was a copy of the resignation letter, already dated, already signed with Marla's digital signature, waiting for Claire's name to be pasted. Nora slid it into a clear sleeve. "Forgery and premeditation." Claire leaned over the desk and spotted a sticky note under the keyboard. "Send to Mercer. Tessa wants it before stream ends." It had an internal email alias. Frank's eyes narrowed. If we pull that email from the server, it links Grant directly to the setup. Nora closed the binder, voice steady. "We file at dawn." Claire wiped her cheeks, feeling something new replacing fear. Direction. Nora typed an affidavit template, naming witnesses, Dr. Patel, the AV tech, the hotel guards, and donors on the live stream. Claire forwarded the insurance cancellation email and Evan's location ping, stacking consequences beside timestamps. Then Frank said, "There's one last piece we need. The hotel's master audio file, and Mercer's compliance team is already trying to delete it." Frank's phone rang on speaker while Nora scrolled through the clinic's server log. "Leo," Frank said. "Tell me you still have the Hastings audio master." A young man's voice answered, breathless. "They just sent a purge request. Mercer and Company compliance. They want tonight's stream corrected before midnight." Nora's eyes lifted. Corrected means erased. Frank looked at Claire. "The hotel uses a third-party archiving vendor," he said. "Every live stream is mirrored to their cloud the moment it starts. Deleting the local file doesn't delete the mirror." Claire swallowed. "So we can still get it?" "If we move now," Nora said. She pulled out her laptop and opened a template motion. "Emergency preservation order. We fax it to the vendor and the hotel. Once they're on notice, any deletion becomes spoliation." Frank pointed to the access log. "And this shows Grant's user ID entered the AV console at 8:04 p.m., the same minute Claire's mic died." Nora nodded. "That's intent, not accident." Claire's hands tightened around the petty cash ledger. "What about Evan? That custody paper. Was it real?" Nora's fingers flew over her phone. She dialed, listened, then mouthed, "Yes." "Family court clerk," she whispered. Into the phone she said, "Thank you." She hung up and turned to Claire. "There is no emergency petition on file, no judge signature, no case number. Grant showed a counterfeit order." Air rushed out of Claire like a sob that turned into anger. "He kidnapped my son in front of police." "He manipulated them," Nora corrected. "And we can fix it." A false court document is a crime. It also makes his protective story collapse. Frank set the thumb drive on the desk, then added a second item, a still photo from the lobby camera feed. Tessa's hand inside Claire's purse,
the sunflower magnet visible between her fingers. Claire stared, heartbeat steadying for the first time. "You got building footage too?" Frank gave a grim half-smile. I asked nicely.
"The super wants no part of Mercer after tonight." Nora slid a printed affidavit toward Claire. "Sign this. Then we go to the precinct, file the report, and serve the preservation order."
Claire picked up the pen. It felt heavier than fear, lighter than shame. She signed, then met Nora's gaze. "Tell me what to do next, now," she said. At 12:07 a.m., Grant's office door pinged open on Frank's screen. Someone was starting the deletion.
Dawn broke gray over Queens when Claire walked out of the precinct with Nora and Frank. The desk sergeant had taken her statement, copied the photos, and typed "possible fraud and larceny" in the report. It wasn't justice yet, but it was a crack in Grant's wall. Nora handed Claire a stamped receipt. "This number matters," she said. "Every time he lies now, you answer with this." They drove straight to the hospital. Ruth lay propped on pillows, face waxy, eyes fluttering open when Claire squeezed her hand. "Did you eat?" Ruth whispered as if Claire's hunger was the emergency. Claire forced a smile. "Soon." A social worker entered with a clipboard. "Mrs. Morgan needs a guarantor," she said. "Otherwise we can only discharge with minimal oxygen." Nora stepped forward. "We're filing for an emergency medical order this morning," she said, calm as a judge. She slid the preservation notice across the counter and added, "And the former insurer has been placed on notice of retaliatory cancellation." The social worker blinked, then nodded. "I'll note it." Claire leaned close to her mother. "I'm going to fix this," she promised. Ruth's fingers, thin as paper, tightened once. Outside the room, Claire checked her phone. Evan hadn't answered since midnight. Grant's last text read, "Don't call him. You lost that right." The old fear rose. Then Claire shut it down like a door. Begging had never saved her. It had only trained him. She opened Nora's affidavit again and reread her own signature. It looked like a line drawn in the sand. "No more private deals," Claire said. "No more letting him decide the truth." Frank nodded. "We go public with facts." Nora pointed at the schedule on her tablet. "Mercer and Company is hosting an IPO integrity breakfast at 9, she said. "Same hotel, same donors, same live stream partner." Claire pictured Grant at a podium, performing honor while crushing hers. She straightened her shoulders. "Then that's where I'll stand," she said, "with the timeline, with the receipts, with witnesses." She borrowed a clean blouse from Nora's spare bag, tied her hair back, and wiped the smudged mascara away. Nothing dramatic, just clear eyes and a steady voice. At 8:58 a.m., Claire pushed through the Hastings doors as Grant's logo flashed on the screen again, while the announcer praised him for integrity, and Claire felt the thumb drive warm in her pocket at last. The Hastings ballroom looked different in daylight. No blue uplights, just bright chandeliers and rows of round tables set with coffee cups and tiny croissants. A banner behind the podium read, "Mercer and Company, IMPO Integrity Breakfast." On the side wall, a screen looped Grant's smiling headshot beside the word "Trust." Claire walked in with Nora on her left and Frank on her right. She wasn't dressed to impress, only to be believed. Navy blouse, plain black slacks, hair tied back, shoulders square. The thumb drive sat in her pocket like a heartbeat. Grant was mid-speech. "We hold ourselves to the highest standards," he began, then froze as Nora raised a hand. "Excuse me," Nora said, voice carrying. Nora Delgado, legal aid. This is Claire Morgan, the clinic employee you publicly accused last night. We're requesting the record be corrected on this live stream right now." A few donors laughed nervously. Grant's smile returned, practiced. "Ma'am, this is not the time." "It's exactly the time," Frank said. He stepped to the AV table, showed his supervisor badge, and plugged in the drive before anyone could stop him. The screen flickered. The room heard the muted click, then Grant's voice from last night. "Security, escort her out. We can't risk contamination." Gasps rippled as Claire's silent mouth moved on screen, cut off by the system. Dr. Patel stood up, face drained. That's my signature on the reimbursement log," he said, staring at the next image Nora held up. Claire did not steal. Those were approved purchases. Grant's jaw twitched. "This is manipulated footage." Nora lifted a stamped police report receipt. "Case number attached," she said. "And here is the vendor preservation notice served at 12:19 a.m. Any deletion attempt is now evidence of spoliation." Whispers turned into anger. A woman in pearls hissed, "You used our donations to destroy her?" Tessa pushed through the crowd toward the AV table, reaching for the cable. Frank blocked her. She slipped, and her clutch spilled open. Keys, a check, and a pink final notice sliding across the carpet. Claire stepped forward and picked up the sunflower magnet. "These were in my purse," she said, loud and steady. She held the check up for the cameras, and the front row saw Grant's initials on the envelope, still damp with rain. Grant grabbed the microphone with both hands and shouted, "Arrest her!" as hotel security started running in. Hotel security rushed in, but they slowed when two NYPD officers, called by the precinct report number Nora had filed at dawn, stepped ahead of them. Nora held the stamped receipt up like a badge. "This is an active complaint," she said, "and that drive is evidence." Grant grabbed the mic again. "She's trespassing and disrupting investors," he barked. "Remove her." A donor in the front row stood, gray hair, surgeon's hands. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. "Last night I let fear silence me," he said. "Claire Morgan never stole a dime. I signed every reimbursement. I watched Mr. Mercer order her microphone cut." Murmurs hardened into outrage. Phones lifted. Someone hissed, "That's retaliation." Another voice, "He canceled her mother's insurance." Frank opened a folder and handed the lead officer a still image. Tessa's hand in Claire's purse, keys and the settlement check visible. "That's from the building lobby camera," Frank said. "Time-stamped. No edits." Tessa's face went white. "It's fake," she whispered, but her clutch lay open on the carpet like a confession. Nora stepped to the podium and spoke into the mic with calm precision. "Here are the access logs showing Mr. Mercer created the incident report during the live stream. Here is the vendor preservation notice served before midnight. Here is the custody paper he flashed, confirmed by family court as non-existent." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "do you have a case number for that order?" Grant's mouth opened, then closed. The room watched him shrink. For the first time, his charm had no place to land. A representative from the live stream vendor raised a hand. "We received the preservation notice," she said. "Compliance requested deletion at 12:07 a.m. That request came from Mercer and Company." Another donor stood, voice sharp. "Our foundation will not fund a clinic run by cowards." Marla's pearls shook as she backed away. The officer turned to Tessa. "Ma'am, stand up." He nodded to his partner. "Possible larceny, fraud, and tampering." Grant lunged for the AV cable, but Frank blocked him. Grant's elbow hit the coffee urn. It clattered, spilling brown liquid across his white sponsor banner. Claire didn't smile. She just held the sunflower magnet in her palm, warm with her mother's kitchen memory. Then Grant leaned close, venom finally honest. "Enjoy this," he hissed. "Because Evan is already on a plane." And Claire saw Nora's phone light up. "Flight confirmed, departing 10:22. At 9:12, Nora was already on the phone with the airline's security desk, reading the police case number and the family court clerk's email aloud. "The custody order is counterfeit," she said. "A child is being removed under fraud. Hold the boarding and notify airport police." Frank texted the precinct. 2 officers left the ballroom with Grant's name still echoing on the live stream. Grant tried to follow them out, but the lead officer stopped him. "You can explain the document at the station," he said, and for once, Grant had no audience to charm. At LaGuardia, Evan was found at gate C-17, hoodie pulled tight, standing beside a suit-clad assistant who kept checking his watch. Evan ran when he saw the officer's badge. "My mom didn't steal," he blurted. "Dad said she'd go to jail if I talked." Claire arrived minutes later, breathless, and dropped to her knees to hug him. Evan's arms locked around her like he'd been holding his breath all night. Nora filmed the reunion, then handed the officer a copy of the fake order. "Add attempted custodial interference," she said. Within an hour, a judge held a Zoom hearing from Chambers, cited the fake order, and granted Claire temporary sole custody. Grant's visits became supervised, and he was barred from contacting Ruth, Evan's school, or Claire's employer directly. By noon, Grant was in handcuffs for fraud, theft, and evidence tampering, with Tessa taken in for questioning after returning Claire's check and keys under pressure. Mercer and Company announced the IPO was postponed, but the investors in that room already knew the truth. Integrity was not a slogan you could print over a lie. That afternoon, Ruth's doctor approved full oxygen support after Nora secured an emergency medical order and a temporary reinstatement of coverage pending investigation. Ruth squeezed Claire's hand and whispered, "You came back." St. Bridget's board issued a public correction on the same stream that shamed her, reinstated Claire, and voted Marla out. Donations surged, not for Grant, but for the clinic's patients. Claire went home to a new deadbolt, a new bank account, and a protective order taped neatly to her fridge. She wasn't rich. She was free, and she finally had witnesses. If you're ever trapped by money, paperwork, or fear, remember this. Keep receipts, save messages, tell one trustworthy person, and never sign away your voice to protect someone else's pride. So that's the story. And if you're still here with me right now, something in it probably touched your heart. Maybe the way Claire kept her dignity when everything around her tried to erase it. The lesson isn't be tough, it's be clear. Keep your receipts, save your messages, tell one trustworthy person, and don't sign away your voice just to keep the peace. When people use money, paperwork, or public shame to control you, the quiet truth is this. Evidence and steady boundaries can bring you back to yourself. The Stoics had a simple kind of healing for moments like that. Marcus Aurelius said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." And Epictetus reminded us, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things." Claire didn't win by screaming. She won by standing, documenting, and refusing to beg. If this ending gave you hope,
or remind you that justice can still happen, please like, share,
and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, what part hit you the hardest?